And welcome back. In recent news, a space heater sparked a massive fire in the Bronx, filling a high-rise apartment building with thick smoke, killing 17 people, including 9 children. Now, as investigators determine what led to an electric space heater sparking the deadliest fire in New York City history in more than 3 decades, tenants and tenant advocacy groups in similar housing are fearing the same conditions are ripe for disaster to strike again. Some are drawing attention to systemic issues that go beyond a single piece of malfunctioning equipment. Joining us now is the founder of Ojala Threads and NYCHA, better known as NYCHA Tenant. We've got Ramona Ferreyra back here on the show. And Ramona, good to have you back.
Hi, thank you so much for having me again.
Yeah, and I definitely want to wish you a happy new year. And unfortunately, we got to start off the new year talking about this tragic news. But let me first go to your thoughts and takes as you saw and watched that fire develop in which the 17 people lost their lives.
So it's hard. I tend to spend my Sundays in practice, in spiritual practice, and I saw the news pretty late into the day. Because of that, I tend to disconnect. And my first churn was when I realized that it was caused by an actual space heater. Because so often when doing work within New York City Housing Authority, we are told by tenants that one of the biggest issues that we consistently face as tenants here is that we don't have heat and hot water. So to find out that this family, what I understand is that the father was there with 8 of his children, and that they were actually using a space heater to provide heat that the landlord was not providing, which is in violation of New York state law, was devastating, because the cost of life can be attributed directly to a landlord being irresponsible.
We were gripped with so many of the pictures, the images, the video of family members trying to race to find one another. You've got people on the other side, firefighters, first responders who are desperately going into that building, trying to save people and trying to bring people out. But the question remains how we got here. And when we talk about a space heater being at the center of that, it's a picture that, first of all, nobody wants to see. But it's also a picture of a bigger problem, because we've been having these conversations for a while about inadequate things. And of course, right now we're still in the allegation phase. So, it's an allegation. But I want to talk to you about that, because when you look at it from that perspective, you could say this is an apartment building. And as a NYCHA tenant, you say this can be me.
Yes, of course. And as a New Yorker, I think every New Yorker should be concerned, because the investment partners, Camber, they are actually related to L&M Development, which is one of the biggest partners that has been doing RAD privatization. So we've talked on the show before about the privatization of public housing and how a lot of these voucher programs are used to, push forward privatization. And that's done through the programs here called RAD Impact. And then there's also the Blueprint proposal, which we've been fighting for a while. And it's really disheartening to think that these partners are not providing essential services, right? Once again, we have a law, we have 311 that is supposed to monitor the calls that tenants make. And the issue that I see is that these partners are always part of people in the know-how and people that are holding power when it comes to housing, the provision of housing, and then also the development of housing policies. So we have been able to look into the management team of this building, and Rick Gropper, Gropper, he is actually on the mayor's transition team, right? So when the mayor is talking about this fire was caused because you didn't close the door, and putting that weight on this father who tried to save his 8 children after the space heater connected with his mattress, or like one of their mattresses. How dare you? It is the landlord's responsibility per New York City law to provide heat, and during the day and during the night, it's different numbers, either 62 or 55 degrees. And on Sunday, we were below that. So to put that burden on this man who I don't even want to imagine how he feels today, knowing that in order to save his 8 children, he possibly could have contributed to the death of 17 of his neighbors, 17 of his country people, because we also found out that this is a building that is housing people from Gambia. So these are Muslim African folks living here in the Bronx. And when we also started looking at the list of complaints made by the building, which is all public information through the building department here in New York City, there were multiple complaints being made in this building about heat. And no one on the mayor's team, no one other than this program is allowing us to talk about how can someone that is not providing the necessary services, how can companies that are benefiting from taxpayer funded privatization of public housing be allowed to sit on a transition team for our new mayor?
Well, let's talk about this for a minute, because here you are, you've got a new mayor that's just in office, and admittedly, he's just got there. I mean, literally, when I think about him, Bronx Borough President Vanessa Gibson, only a week on the job, and then to have this delivered in their lap, to have to deal with a tragedy like this right off the beginning. Not a lot of time to really get in the saddle and get in the reins. What is it that you would want to see, and what is it that you would expect to see following something like this?
Accountability. And I want to be really clear that accountability to me always returns to policy, right? So the work that I do through Safe Section 9 and Ojala Threads is helping folks shape policy so that policy serves them. The ways that we can do that with this case is I am calling on the Attorney General, the Mayor, the City Council, and folks up in Albany to add an arm to the bill which demands heat be provided at certain temperatures, and make that something that's enforceable. So we need to start asking ourselves, if a company, a landlord or a management company is not providing heat, and there are multiple complaints provided to 311, once those complaints are being provided, what is the enforcement? I don't want it to be a fine. I don't want it to be a letter. Sometimes folks call 311, and I had posted something on Instagram about this accountability that needs to be asked for. And folks started messaging me saying, well, when I call 311, they said I have to wait 3 days. So I have to go 3 days with no heat, and then something happens. And then what happens is that they get a letter. I want it to be criminally enforceable. And when we look at the lawsuits that are already coming out, the class action suit, one of the things that suit is mentioning is that the landlord was not providing heat. So money will never bring back these families and erase the trauma that these families are being left with. What we need to do is create accountability through enforceable criminal portions being added to that legislation.
And when we look at public housing, we know that there are a lot of challenges within public housing. You're talking about heat, you're talking about equipment, we talk about elevators, we talk about cleanliness. These are issues that have not gone away yet. How much, unfortunately, can a tragedy like this bring about reform in these areas, given the fact that it seems as though we only talk about this when things are at its worst?
And one of the things I mentioned to a lot of the folks that have connected with me on social media as a result of my post and folks that I do work with is, during a tragedy, the community comes together and we respond and we take care of each other because we know that no one else is going to. And I want folks that are doing the mutual aid, that are gathering the supplies, that are getting the donations, to not forget this other side, which is you have to take this tragedy and you have to ensure that it does not repeat itself. And the only way to do that is through making policy changes. So about a month ago, I highlighted how here at my development and Mitchell Houses in the South Bronx, we had a water main break. The water main break has continued to flow. So when the temperatures dropped, we had a nice skating rink. And when they're high, we have a small river flowing through. Something happened last night. I'm sure that the freezing temperatures that we've had over the last few days contributed to this. And one of our buildings is now without water. So they woke up this morning to no water. So we have an opportunity to demand that folks actually be held accountable, and that we don't resort to only saying, well, money is going to fix this. Because folks have been suing public housing and have been suing HUD and management companies for decades. And Congress is a slumlord. So to us, the thing is, the call to action is, how do we turn these incidents into lessons that can impact policy and then stop this from happening again?
When we talk about happening again, obviously a lot of people say this is something that we don't want to see happen again, a tragedy of this magnitude. And when we look, we find that probably 3 decades it's gone by since we've
Mhm.
seen something of this magnitude, and we never ever want to really see this again. But there are some things that we could do as a public, and there are some things that the public could do in terms of engagement when it talks about elected officials, housing officials. So, what can the public do to be more of an advocate for people when you've got issues like heat, when you've got issues like water? I remember doing a story in a particular high-rise building where a family literally had. Literally the pipe was out and there was no faucet and the water was just coming out piping hot. And it wasn't until we put the cameras on that we were
Yeah.
able to actually see some change. What can the public actually do to really raise their voice during times like these?
So for our community, what really matters is that we start voicing our demands to elected officials. For too long, communities of color and those that have been disenfranchised have really had a king and subject relationship with elected officials. And I refuse to participate in that mentality. If you hold an elected office, you work for the public that you represent. So some of the tips that I've given people on that want to act is contact the attorney general, contact the mayor's office, and contact city council to begin with. Each time that you call, the question needs to be in regards to the fire that happened in the Bronx, what criminal enhancements are, what criminal enhancements can be made to that bill so that we can hold landlords and management companies accountable when they're not providing heat. Um, Other things that folks can do is they can tweet and they can write letters. It is so important. And a lot of my tenants will say, well, why does it matter if I call? I like to tell folks, I worked in constituent services in the state capitol back in Hawaii. When we got one phone call about an issue, we assumed 1,000 people felt that way.
Mm-hmm.
And I want folks to really understand that anytime that someone takes a moment to dial a phone number and speak to someone in constituent services, and that's who you should be asking for in each of these elected offices. Say, I need to speak to constituent services. What do you want to talk about? The fire in the Bronx. What do you want to say? I want there to be changes to the law so that we can hold these landlords and management companies responsible for not giving heat. They're going to assume 1,000 of your neighbors feel the same way. And that's powerful, and folks really need to own that power, especially after everything we've been through for the last 2 years. I think that being afraid and again, having that king to subject relationship doesn't serve us. So we need to step into our power and demand more.
Talk to me about smoke alarms because that's also a huge factor too. In a lot of NYCHA buildings, we find that smoke alarms are not being, that are not being updated and taken care of, as well as fire extinguishers. Can you give us a little insight as to what you've been finding out when it comes to these particular issues?
So I remember the fire that happened out in Harlem, and it was a similar situation where it was a family, multiple children, and I believe one of the parents died. And because of that situation, what was found out was that NYCHA was not properly installing stoves, and the stove had triggered that flame, and it became uncontrollable because of the gas leak. So that changed NYCHA's policy to where NYCHA now is not allowed to install stoves. So if you have a faulty stove or your stove breaks down and you need a new one, NYCHA will deliver the stove. But now we have union trained and certified folks, technicians that will come out about once every week, and they will do, a sweep of buildings, and whoever needs a stove to be installed, they will do it. So this is a way to make sure that that doesn't happen again. But if we take it a step further, what would happen is that NYCHA would start hiring folks that are union trained, that are subject matter experts in whatever work they're doing, and that they'll be on staff at each development. Because while we love the fact that we are now getting safe installations, sometimes installation can take up to 2 months because you're put on a roster and you have to wait your turn. So I think that's a great example of how a tragedy changed the policy for New York City Housing Authority, but it hasn't been taken far enough. NYCHA continues to contract out most of its work. And that's something that we at Safe Section 9 really have issue with, because we know that union employment can provide opportunities to our neighbors and can provide work to us, work orders being fulfilled in a way that it's done correctly. So I'm always hopeful that we're not going to settle for just the basics, that we're going to be demanding excellence. And excellence would be making sure that NYCHA hires folks that are properly trained and stops subcontracting. Because a lot of these issues with smoke detectors, with piping, with painting, all of these jobs are being done by folks that sometimes subcontract to unskilled labor because it's cheaper. And that's been, all over the news as well. So we need to put a stop to that.
Earlier today, I had the opportunity to talk to somebody from the American Red Cross of Greater New York who talked about the work that's going on with volunteers, still assisting with housing, still assisting with emotional issues, still assisting with financially the families that are actually been impacted by this particular fire at Twin Peaks. I want to go here and ask about the emotional, right? Here you have a fire that's claimed the lives of 17 people, 9 children, people with smoke inhalation, and yet and still, we hear the stories of families actually returning to that building. Yes. There's so many people that have been affected by this from an emotional and a psychological standpoint. And the question is asked, when you have a tragedy like this, what is the reality of possibly people being relocated? Maybe I wasn't directly impacted by the fire, but I was directly impacted from a psychological and emotional place. And this may not be the place that I want to live. What kind of recourses available for tenants who've gone through this?
I would say that there are none available. When we have had tragedies at my development, we had a young man commit suicide. He's someone that I just can't ever forget, because his case was it was just so devastating. He had been in jail. He came out and was trying to get employment. He was backed up on his child support. His driver's license was canceled, so he was fired from his job and couldn't meet the child support. And he felt like he had been already told that he was going to be jailed again for back payment that he couldn't catch up on. And he jumped off his building. And he did it in the middle of the day. It was like 10:30 in the morning. And I remember watching folks, it was a nice sunny day and people were just running around, the development, doing their daily errands. And so many people witnessed that. And one of the things that I raised was, when our community faces this time of horror and trauma or gun violence, we never receive trauma counseling. We are never told, let's sit down and have a conversation. How are you feeling? What do you need? And what are you afraid of? And are you sleeping? And I saw today on the news that folks living in the top 2 floors are going to be allowed to, return home. And like you said, if 17 people perished in such a horrible way, right? To choke on smoke. I can't imagine what those 7 children were feeling and what their parents were feeling as they succumbed. And to have that energy in that space and to have to return to those homes without doing the psychological work that's necessary, and with all of the stigma that therapy faces in Black and Brown communities, it's irresponsible, because a Sandy Hook would get counseling, but a PS 51 in the South Bronx wouldn't, right? And that's another disparity that our communities face. And when we look at the way that public housing was shaped and the services that used to be provided 40, 50 years ago, when the people that lived here were white, you had, community service, and you had our community centers providing programming that empowered our neighbors and that empowered folks. And we no longer have that. So you have a people now who for 30 years have been humiliated, have been underserved, and have been shamed by the conditions in which we live in. And then you put us through a trauma like this and you want us to just keep going. And
right.
it's unfair.
And so we know that emotional services are needed, and we know that that counseling is definitely needed for so many people. But why do you think that it is that it's so hard to get the services that really are rightfully deserved? Is it simply because of a failure of those who are on the inside to lack raising their voice? Or is it more of the fact that those persons who you're raising your voice to have actually decided to close their ears?
I think it's a failure of the city planning department and Office of Emergency Services. So in my previous life, I worked for the Department of Defense, doing disaster management, response planning, and mitigation. And a core component of the United Nations protocol on how you answer a disaster includes mental health. So if something happens, you are supposed to have a component of how do we fine tune this community and how do you give them the support necessary for them to process what they've just been through. And time again, we've seen horrible tragedies. I remember that there was a shooting at the playground in Brooklyn. I think it was about 2 summers ago. And the number of casualties was so high that the community could not process it. And folks kept asking, why is it when there is gun violence, when there is trauma in this city facing people of color, we don't have this type of response? But then when you look at even the Medicaid system, which I depend on, I go to therapy and I'm very open about that because I know that it benefits me tremendously. Someone on Medicaid gets 30 minutes a week with a therapist. And my therapist has told me, I'm someone who holds master's degrees and went to, the Harvard Kennedy School. So it's very easy for me to, get on my phone and at 101, be in the conversation, talking about what really needs to be talked about and allowing him to help me build the toolkit to handle my mental health pressures, like the grief from my grandmother's death last year. When he's dealing with other clients that don't even have a high school education, it takes him 20 minutes to get that person to get to that point where I get in a minute. And
Right.
he's shared with me often. He said, it's really difficult to provide service because he works out of a community, a nonprofit in Harlem. He says, it's very difficult for me to help people make progress when I only get 30 minutes with them a week. And when his schedule allows, he'll extend the sessions to 45 minutes, to an hour, to whatever he can fit in, because he knows that you cannot help someone develop the toolkit to process the trauma that they're facing in 30 minutes. And that's what Medicaid gives us in New York City.
Amazing. And I mean, I think when we talk about the inequities that people face, and this is what the show's about, we talk about the different inequities that people face, but based on housing and based on, where you live and what you make, it really determines the quality of services that a person gets. And unfortunately, when you have tragedies such as this, it further brings to light the inequities that so many people are actually facing. Are you hopeful that we'll see some reform come out of a tragedy such as this? It's terrible that it has to be a tragedy that brings people to a place of realization, but hopefully we can get not just realization, but some reaction.
I have faith that folks will hear this call, right, to action and will start calling elected officials and once again saying, need to speak to constituent services. I want to talk about this fire and I want to know how we're going to be holding landlords criminally accountable for not providing heat, because that is the root of this issue. And I think that if enough people do that, we won't see this happen again, because the Attorney General will have to respond. The mayor's office is going to have to change their talk. And City Council and the State Assembly will hopefully, also hear that call to action. But it takes people acting, right? My hope is always in the gourd or in the container in which the community sits, not where the elected officials are. I think that the community can shift what the elected officials do, and we have that power. We just haven't tapped into it fully.
Yeah. Well, Ramona, we got to leave it there, but thank you so much for joining us here on the Social Justice Forums again, trying to bring some light through this tragedy and also try to bring some awareness to this tragedy. I think you've done a great job of highlighting and letting people know some of the things and that we face in terms of a housing inequity right there in public housing and what we can do in order to make things better, hitting some things on the head. Ramona, thanks a lot for being with us.
Yeah, thanks so much, Daren. And if folks want to, follow the work that we're doing in NYCHA, definitely head to SafeSection9.org or Safe Section 9 on Facebook.
All right. Well, we'll definitely be taking a look there, and the website is there for people to be able to watch, so to go to, I should say. Ramona, thanks a lot. Taking a quick break. We'll be back with more show in a minute.